If folks would have a seat, we'll get started in a couple minutes, please. Wow, that was fast. Normally it's like a few whistles, coaxing, prodding. My name is Bob Lavoie. I'm a partner at BCG. More importantly, I'm a board member with Parent Child Plus. Let me be the first to welcome you to Hudson Yards and thank you all for coming. Really appreciate everyone making the time this morning. We've got a great panel lined up and a great topic for discussion today. So I'll turn it over to Josh to introduce our panel. If anyone needs washrooms, the same way you came in down the hall, please, there'll be a side door there. And we'll be keeping the coffee warm and the food full. So enjoy the rest of the morning. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Bob. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending. I want to thank BCG for hosting our second installment of the School Readiness Forum here in this spectacular site, which makes us look really good. So just real briefly, the School Readiness Forum, if you haven't attended yet, is an initiative that's hosted by Parent Child Plus. I'm also on the board of Parent Child Plus. And it's really an awareness building platform for us to try and promote a discussion around the benefits of early child learning and school readiness and parent and communal involvement in the process of getting kids ready for school and really their lifetimes. It is the closest thing to a silver bullet that we have based on all the brain research, which I'm not going to talk about, but you can read about. But yet, it barely registers in discussions around ed reform, etc. So this is not ostensibly a fundraising event. It's really a discussion, and we're so pleased that you've joined us to participate in it. Tony Miller has been a good friend of mine for a number of years, and I thought that based on his background, which you'll hear more about, he would be a great person to be involved in this next installment of the School Readiness Forum. There's so many different parts of his career that I could highlight, but I know Tony started as a private equity investor and then was asked by Arnie Duncan to join the US DOE, and he was COO and Deputy Secretary of the DOE in the Obama administration, and has recently come back into the private equity world and was a founding partner of Vistria, which is one of the most active and successful investors in the education sector. And now he's in the process of launching a new fund, so new that we're just getting used to pronouncing it. Excalir? Excalir. He maybe will define that for you and let you know what it means. But I could go on forever. Tony's one of those guys. When I said, Tony, would you be interested in getting involved with this? He said yes without even knowing what I was asking him to get involved in. That's just the way he rolls. So I will finish by just saying Tony Miller is a private equity investor with a heart and a soul, and I think if you don't know him, you'll become more familiar with that as this morning progresses. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Tony to introduce the other panelists.
Thanks, Josh. Really my pleasure to be here, and if you know Josh, which I'm sure many of you do, it was an easy call to take and an easy answer, because he really is committed, not just to be a professional, but to make a difference. And so, in terms of Excalir, I will come back to that. It actually means to build, to cultivate, to develop. And since we focus exclusively on either education or human capital management, we thought it was kind of very fitting to pick a name that means that. Besides, every other name that a private equity could be called has been taken, so it was an exercise. Josh was kind of with my background, but the reality is, relative to my fellow panelists, they're the real experts here today. So I think we're in for a very, very exciting discussion. If you'll indulge me, I'm just going to introduce by reading the short bios of each to give you a sense, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Let me start with Kelsey Clark. She's also with BCG, and she's a member of their public sector and people and organizational practices. She's also a member of the firm's education leadership team in the U.S. She focuses primarily on education employment in the welfare sector, and her client work has included supporting the development and implementation of a comprehensive early childhood education strategy for one of the largest urban school districts. So she brings real an understanding of these issues at the ground level. She's on the board of Child Poverty Action Lab, as well as Lumen Education, a Dallas-based charter school network. She's based in Dallas. Joining us next is just going down the line, is Catherine Stevens. She leads the Early Childhood Education Program at AEI, American Enterprise Institute, which is a DC think tank, where she focuses on research policy and politics of early child care and education. The focus of their studies have been on the role of early learning and increasing opportunity for low-income Americans. Catherine travels around the country, speaking about the critical need for high-quality early childhood supports. And I think that's going to be one of the themes that will continue to reinforce the notion of quality and how we think about quality. It's not just early childhood, but quality matters. And she addresses topics of both child care and home visiting. And in February, she hosted a forum at AEI entitled Going Upstream, Closing the Achievement Gap Before It Starts, in which she and Sarah, as you know Sarah, and Ian Rowe of Public Prep spoke about their work and their collaboration. Prior to AEI, Dr. Stevens founded and led Teachers for Tomorrow and began her career in public education as a preschool teacher. So again, a very unique perspective from both a research, but also as truly a practitioner earlier in her career. And lastly, we have Matari, and I may mispronounce your last name, Matari, so I apologize. Camerati,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
She's the Director of Workforce Development in the Office of Governor Cuomo. Previously, Matari worked as the Director and Head of Credit Investor Relations and Product Management at BlackRock. She was also at the Clinton Foundation as the Director of Job One and the Director of Program Development for the Office of Hillary Rodham Clinton. She serves as the Director for International Economic Affairs at the White House, National Security Council, and the National Economic Council, where she led the White House work to convene the first G20 Labor and Employment Ministers meeting. So again, a very unique, highly qualified perspective in thinking about the policy ramifications and also thinking about it in economic terms. So as I said, we really do have an expert panel, and I think that speaks to the quality of the organization that Parent Child Plus is and the talent that they can convene. So with that, today we're going to spend some time talking about the two-generational effect and the importance of quality early childhood education and the impact on the labor force. And so I think to frame the discussion, we thought we'd frame it holistically before we, if you will, dive down on some of the specific topics. And with that, I'll ask Kelsey if she could kick us off to frame it more holistically, to give you a sense of how we think about this notion of the two-generational impact.
Okay, so it's two, as mentioned, vital issues. We've got workforce development and early childhood education. And so I wanted to just start in talking about some trends of those and what we're seeing. And so, as Tony mentioned, I do a lot of my work in the education space, but over the years have seen that then merges with workforce development. So a lot of my work actually is between those two and actually the intersection of those two. So let's start with workforce development. I think there's few other issues that have received as much attention from this as from the corporate, the public, and the philanthropic communities. Starting on the corporate side, talent and skills is probably one of the most critical things in the business community. So, in fact, 77% of CEOs are saying that the availability of key skills is the biggest threat to their business. So this is top of mind for them, thinking about skills development that we see across all of our corporate clients. You also see how workforce development is also more associated with economic development. And so traditionally, communities would use things such as tax incentives to attract businesses or aggressive marketing strategies to get people to relocate. And what communities are realizing is that they have to double down on their homegrown talent to be able to attract businesses and actually sustain economic development. And then you also see it coming about more in the philanthropic community. And so in a survey recently, we did 90 education funders, and 40% of them said that they were going to increase their funds to workforce and career readiness over the next coming years. So across all of these players that we see, they're all very focused on workforce development and what's going on there. At the same time, you've got early childhood development. And so this continues to be a vital thing for communities. More and more governments are actually investing in pre-K and 3K programs. You also have continuing, evidence that accumulates, starting with Heckman and others, but just building on the importance of this, and it continues to show that there's a double-digit return on investment in these type of programs. And so this is a clear issue. Both of these are top of mind for governments, for corporations, for communities, for funders. But too often you actually see them are at odds. People see them unrelated or even conflicting priorities. And in reality, you need to think of them in tandem. And so, we often think about workforce development as being the pipeline of a single individual. I go to early childhood, go through K-12, higher ed, and then there's continuous and on-the-job learning and upskilling once you're there. But in reality, and in most circumstances, within a family, you have multiple people in that pipeline, and they're all interacting, and the interdependencies of those are actually crucial for both of generations to succeed. So for people in the workforce or those that want to be in the workforce, they actually need that high quality and consistent early childhood and support in being a parent. And then those kids actually need, a stable economic environment and knowing that their caregivers has, the knowledge and the support that they need for their development. And so I think talking about these two issues and what we're talking about today is the most effective approach, right? So you have these two big issues, they're interconnected. How can we actually solve them both at once instead of looking at them one at a time? This also got validated with some of the work that BCG recently did with Parent-Child Plus. So we actually engaged with them on a pro bono project and helped them craft their strategic plan. And the common theme that we heard talking to experts and funders in this space was this desire to serve the whole community and take a more holistic approach so that every generation is succeeding, not just focusing one at a time. And so in today's conversation, I'm hoping that we can actually talking about ways to actually bridge the gap and think about how do these things link and how do we benefit from a more collaborative and interactive approach.
Thank you, Kelsey. Maybe to bring in some of the other panelists, maybe Catherine, I'll turn to you. And I think the first question, let's just, again, well, I think this audience is familiar with it. Let's just underscore the critical importance of quality early childhood education. What is the impact? How does quality early childhood education matter in both driving long-term achievement and closing, if you will, the achievement gap?
So first of all, I want to say thank you. So, whoops. Is that right? No. Is it on? Yeah. Okay. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for having me. Sarah, thank you so much. I had the enormous pleasure of meeting Sarah, as Tony mentioned, at an event that I organized at AAI in February. We met, I think, like in the event, in Row. And then the topic of the event was going upstream, closing the achievement gap before it starts. And I think that is really core to what we're talking about today. So for the last several decades, we have invested an enormous amount of resources in the K-12 schools, as we know. Now $700 billion annually. And the good schools are extremely important. What's becoming increasingly clear, though, is that the gaps, the achievement gaps that we measure in K-12, that we're trying to address in K-12, are largely present before children even get to school. So there's a little bit of, that story of the guy crawling around under the street lamp looking for his keys on the sidewalk, and the policeman asks him, where did you drop them here? He said, no, I dropped the keys in the bushes by my front door, but the light is better here. So the idea being that we are the focusing on K-12 is kind of where the light is, but it's not necessarily where the core problem is. So there are the research, the brain research that has come out of the last 20 years, but really even in just the last 5 years, is making it very clear that the first 5, and really the first 3 years of life, are enormously important in laying the foundation for children's capabilities across the board. So when they're older, they have reading and they have math and they have various skills. But in very young children, there's not that kind of compartmentalization. Skills and abilities are developing in a holistic manner, and those skills and abilities, the development of those skills and abilities are driven by, as Tony was saying, the quality of the environment that the children are in. That's what drives early human development, is the quality of the environment, which is, for very young children, home and childcare. That's where they are. What we mean when we talk about quality in early childhood is a little different than what we might think of with older children. It boils down to the quality of the human interactions. The back and forth, responsive nurture is absolutely crucial, and human beings are hardwired to develop. The brain develops in the context of those nurturing interactions. They're not, you can't scale nurture. We are hardwired to develop in this kind of very one-on-one, as I said, nurturing environment. So what the research shows is that the most important environment for children's development, whether they are in out-of-home environments or not, is the home. So that's something we sort of think, but it is also, the research is very clear about that the home environment, the people who are the parents in the child's home are enormously influential in that child's development. And then when children are spending considerable amounts of time in out-of-home environments, those environments are enormously powerful in their development. So there is research that shows that when children are in high-quality environments, home and high-quality early childhood settings, they graduate from high school, they go on, they're successful later in life. However, there is a much more immediate impact, which we have paid insufficient attention to, and that is kindergarten readiness. So children are arriving in kindergarten already far behind. And if we improve the quality of their early environments, immediately there's going to be a payoff in terms of their success in the school system.
I think this notion of nurturing, it struck me when I was visiting a school that was, in fact, these were 2-year-olds, and many of us have probably can relate to this experience. They were trying to talk to this notion of kind of interaction, the rule of 5, and the notion of you see a bunch of 2-year-olds. And you could imagine a classroom and the teacher's like, get in line, I'll be quiet, don't talk, we're gonna go down. And you think, boy, what a disciplined, well-managed classroom. And it's very counterintuitive that that's actually very counter to the development of a 2-year-old. And it's like, no, what you actually want to do is foster that ongoing chatter and exchange and nurture it in a very constructive way. When they ask a question, don't answer it, but ask a question and elicit the interactions. So I do think this notion of how do we recognize quality and then instill quality and appreciate the impact that's having in closing the achievement gap is critical. So with that, I want to first talk about, or next talk about, the impact then of when you have access to high quality, or again in the home or not in the home. But as we know, oftentimes, many times the primary caregiver, right, oftentimes is not in the home, at least on a full-time basis. As you said, they're actually in the workforce. So now there's a workforce issue in terms of how do we actually kind of deal with the challenges? How does it manifest itself in terms of the quality child care, or the lack of quality care, child care, which you've often said, child care and education are synonymous at that age. But how do we deal with the interaction? What are some of the costs when that is not working?
Yeah. So it's interesting, we actually did a pretty extensive study in Dallas, looking at this. And so it started, actually, we are on the childcare side of like, why are there not, right? Like you see that like, there's 65% of zip codes don't have high quality childcare, or what we call childcare deserts of what's going on there, we don't have access. And we, of course, like we normally do, what's the impact then to students? But we also looked at then, well, what's the impact on the other side too? And so what we actually found is when we surveyed non-working parents, 60% of them said that childcare was one of the top 5 reasons of why they actually weren't participating in the workforce. And they're like, okay, that's interesting. And then what we also found is then when we talked to the business community of, well, we can't find the skilled workers. But then when we look like, well, the skilled workers are out there, they just have a barrier because there's not high quality childcare that they're getting access to. And so you see this hitting multiple fronts, right? So yes, the kids, the child, and we talked about the benefits of those high qualities, and you see, you know, kindergarten readiness in Dallas in particular, you know, for those low income students, a high quality experience can put them on par with their affluent peers. And so it really can make a difference, but you just have a vast deserts out there, and it's impacting the kids, and it's also impacting the employment in the workforce because they don't have access to those to then be able to go off and work.
Let me just add something to that. And I think the other thing that I wrote a report a couple of years ago called Workforce of Today, Workforce of Tomorrow, the Business Case for High Quality Childcare. And one of the things that I observed in that report was the business community invests a lot in the K-12 system across the country, right? Because the business community recognizes that the K-12 system is a pipeline for their development. And it's like just sort of broadening the vision like 4 years, right? To a point in the pipeline which is actually much more impactful. And the thing about childcare, unlike K-12, K-12 is an important part of the workforce preparation pipeline. However, it doesn't cover working hours, right? Childcare serves 2 purposes at the same time. And I think that that's what employers are starting to see. So there's for example, in Mississippi, there is a factory that was having terrible time getting employees, and the Mississippi was combining its early childhood, childcare, and workforce development funding streams, and helped him, through combining those, helped him build a childcare center at his factory, that using public dollars, workforce development dollars to help build that, and then childcare subsidies to help subsidize the childcare. So that's you know, that's a very forward-looking guy in Mississippi, but I think that's the kind of thing that the connection that people are starting to make.
I think what struck me in some of the research that you've done and that you forwarded to us as we were preparing for this, just to quantify it a bit, the notion of loss of productivity, right? Absenteeism, how these things manifest themselves, which was earnings. Working parents lose on average $8,900 in lost earnings, which accounts for about $98 billion a year. Businesses, in terms of the revenue that's lost and the churn, has a cost to business of about $16 billion a year. Taxpayers, in terms of income tax and sales tax loss, $25 billion a year. So these are numbers, as we say, with a B in front of behind them. And so, I mean, we're talking about a significant economic consequence. So with that, you talked about, you know, it's forward thinking in terms of really trying to bring high quality early child care and early childhood education to the communities. How do we think about this as a sector? Maybe, Medora, you can talk about, you know, the sector and early childhood as an important sector in the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely something that, particularly at this stage in the economy where we have a 3.8% unemployment rate in New York State, outside of New York City, 4.2% in New York City, it's often something else besides skills that's keeping an individual from the workplace. And childcare is one of the most predominant issues that we hear about in New York State government. Governor Cuomo has created a child care task force to start addressing the kind of lack of affordable and quality child care across New York State. Somebody recently told me they think similar to, it seems like Dallas, we have about a 65% of New York State communities are considered child care deserts, which is incredible, incredibly frustrating. And so I do think that it is something that we're thinking about in this kind of new initiative that I oversee, and this is the first time we've had a director of workforce development in New York State. And my role was created to kind of take a more comprehensive view of this issue, which does include childcare. And so within kind of the new funding stream that I oversee, we have the ability for organizations to couple workforce development programs with childcare, with transportation, with other types of subsidies and interventions that we know will actually ensure that individuals not only get a job, but retain their jobs over time as well, which we're really excited about how we start to take on that set of barriers that are keeping people from working. And then I think on the other side, we often don't think about, which is where I really appreciate your question, the childcare industry, as an employer, and as a needed employer, where we have kind of consistent demand. We're not trying to manufacture demand. There actually is significant demand for, again, affordable and quality childcare across New York State. And we do have a few barriers that are keeping the industry from going, including low wages, particularly for those who are not skilled workers. Folks who may be kind of just entering the field because there's availability, but don't have the proper training and incentives to enter the field and ultimately move up and thrive. So that's something that we are focused on with the new funding initiative that I've overseen, but also from a policy perspective, how can we continue to professionalize childcare? I think we have a challenge with some occupations that have been traditionally done by women that we undervalue in some ways, that these are professional occupations. And so it's something we're trying to think about for a swath of industries where traditionally women have been kind of unpaid and kind of doing the work of how do we actually start to professionalize not only childcare, but home health care aides, a number of other parts of our kind of larger social infrastructure where again we have significant demand. We don't treat them as professional occupations, therefore we get bad outcomes. And I think childcare is particularly where you see those bad outcomes multiply over time, which not only affects the individuals, but of course our economy as well. And I think particularly it's becoming just that much more stark at a time when jobs are moving to skill-based, right? So it's not just even that any of us can go get a even four-year degree and be done with our education. Workforce development happens throughout one's career in a pretty dramatic way these days. And unless we're setting that foundation, folks are young, through skilled, trained, well-paid childcare employees, we're kind of losing, we're losing the battle that a lot of other countries have figured out.
It's interesting to talk about this as a sector of the economy. Again, these are 2016 figures, so dated, but there was an assessment that the overall economic impact was just under $100 billion. When you think about the importance of early child care, the sector as to the economy, about $40 billion in terms of earnings, and about 2 million jobs, 1.5 direct and then the spillover. So you're talking about a significant portion. I think, Catherine, you highlighted earlier, I know one of the challenges, and Midori just teed it up, is this notion of the qualifications in early childhood learning versus in traditional K-12. Yes. And so what you're finding is actually the qualifications are different, yet the wage scale is very different. And so that you actually find then the ability to attract and retain quality in the early child care setting. It can be challenging because there's a natural migration then to dealing with children moving into a traditional K-12 institution to try to get higher wage, better benefits, et cetera. And oftentimes the same qualifications that make you an effective K-12 instructor are not actually the same underlying capabilities that you need to be an effective in an early childhood education setting.
Yeah, so this is an area in which there is a lot of disagreement. There's probably disagreement up here on this panel. My observation, as having been a preschool teacher myself, having run a K-12 teacher training program, that was an apprenticeship model program here in New York City, is that two things. One, in fact, as you just said, the skills that you need to be very effective with little children are different from this skill. If you can count to 20 and you know the alphabet, you're good in terms of content, right? So you don't even really have to know why the sky is blue. They'll ask you, but I don't think any of us even know. I mean, people have managed to have conversations with their children all the time in the face of that question, and they do not know the answer. So you really don't need a lot of content knowledge. What you need is the disposition to interact well with kids, and enough knowledge, which some people just have because of the families they grew up in, enough knowledge about how little children are, what they need, right? Because of, and so that's part one. Part two is what I saw in the program that I ran in New York City, is that an apprenticeship model of training teachers makes a lot of sense. And I think this is going to be especially true in early childhood. So when I say apprenticeship, you're working alongside an experienced person. I think that the childcare sector is one idea, that one very, I would say prominent idea, is that we need to raise the credential requirements for child care workers. I am not in that camp. I think we need to raise the pay of child care workers, but without restricting entry in such a way that people who could be very good at it would have access to a solid middle-class job without having to get a lot of education. So this is, and I will hand the microphone to the people on the panel who disagree with me in 1 second. But I think that this sector is underutilized as a source of good paying jobs that high school graduates with some kind of an additional sort of training credential could do. And in some ways, if you set it up correctly, that could create a partnership with parents in a way that can be very supportive of families, as opposed to the K-12 model, which is more, the K-12 teachers are the expert, and the parent is kind of secondary. I think that is not a model that we want to be creating for early childhood. Who wants the microphone?
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe, yes, I'm sure you're grappling with these kinds of challenges.
No, but yeah, I mean, to be clear, I actually don't disagree with anything you said.
Okay,
I think
yeah,
there's two proxies for professionalization.
Yes.
Pay is the most important.
Yes.
Skills
Great
and kind of
way to put it.
credentials are the other.
Yep.
And so I think that's a massive problem we have with traditional care industries, home health care aides, many types of healthcare aides, childcare, is low pay. And what does low pay result in is also low skills. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need a credential to overcome the low skill. It's if you kind of raise pay, raise standards,
Exactly.
which can be done a number of ways, you receive the same outcome. So I actually agree with a lot of what you said. We do have this kind of societal view, which continues to be unfortunate, though, that these are not kind of meaningful middle-class occupations, to use your words.
Yeah.
So.
And curious, Kelsey, in your work in Dallas and engagement with employers, do they confront this issue in terms of what it actually takes to provide early quality? They understand the cost of not having it and how that manifests itself in lost productivity. And they also understand the importance of having it, I'm sure from their own experience, but in terms of the practical barriers.
Yeah, I don't think there's a good understanding, especially on the business side, of like how like the economic model of a child care center is actually just broken. Like it doesn't work, right? It costs too much. Yeah, we're just talking about how like we actually need to increase the cost of it. It's really painful. I feel like middle skills workers get the brunt of it. So like the lower end usually get some sort of subsidy or at least it's available to them to get support. So then you've got people that are in the middle income who are spending 20-30% of their income on childcare. And so that's why it makes sense that they are choosing to then exit the workforce and actually stay at home. Like, you know, we've got the data where it's like that's actually logical and makes a lot of sense. And so I don't think there's a clear understanding of what it truly costs for this high quality care and what that actually means, and then what's their role and how they can actually help with that. Like you see some, like one of my favorite examples is like Patagonia. who actually has on-site childcare and like they actually subsidize it. They're like, yes, it's an expense, but like we get more productive workers, they stay, like it actually like it's a good ROI for them. And it also at the same time employees, right? Like they feel like they are supported, they feel like they are there for key moments in their child's lives, and so it's not like they're just dropping it off, so they can really then be engaged at work. And so I think the business just needs to understand the vital role this has in the workforce of today and tomorrow, what it actually takes to have a model that works, and then how can they actually play a role in that.
You know, there's something that I know I keep saying this, but some of you probably remember, what was it, 20 years ago, there was kind of disagreement about spending a lot of money on K-12. And that's gone. I mean, it's amazing. I am in conservative states all over the place, and there's just spending per student has doubled or tripled across the country. It's tripled in Alabama, it's tripled in Mississippi, for example. I mean, everybody is on board with this. The way that that is funded is with taxpayer dollars. And the business community, as I said before, they play a huge role in every single state in this. They understand this is a lot of their taxpayer dollars. On average, it is across the country, it's a third of state general funds are spent on the K-12 system. In New York City, it's probably, in New York State, excuse me, it's probably even more, would be my guess, it varies. This is an enormous commitment we have to this. And yet, the pipeline into it is entirely broken. That makes no sense whatsoever. That is like a car factory where when they get to the point of putting the door on the car, they can't because the frame's all bent, and then the whole thing shuts down, the assembly line shuts down, and they like have to adjust the frame, and then they just keep doing it that way. That's a car factory that's going to go out of business because you're not looking at the pipeline for success. So I think that this is a sort of a tragedy of the commons problem where Patagonia is paying for something that is going to reduce the cost of K-12 in those communities, but they're doing it by themselves, and therefore they are not getting an adequate payoff, right? However, if the community as a whole recognized that without ensuring high-quality environments at home, which is a lot of parent-child plus work, and in childcare environments, we are going to continue with what we see, which, for example, in the last year of the National Assessment for Education Progress, about 50% of high school seniors are scoring below basic for math and reading. So they've been in school for 13 years at a cost of, what, $150,000. And what is yielded out of that, half of them, these are the ones who have managed to make it to high school, right? Which is, makes it to senior year. Half literally are close to functional, not functionally, not competent in reading and math. So that's just not working. And we're not, so we've got to be, we've been trying very hard to fix that problem by looking at the K-12 schools. The cost of childcare, it makes no sense that the cost of per child in childcare would be less than the cost per child in elementary school. It doesn't make any sense, right? Because the ratios, you can have 25 fourth graders with one teacher. You cannot have 25 babies with one person. It doesn't work like that. So there's going to be a much higher human resource cost, and we're spending on average about $12,000 per kid for K-12. So we can imagine that it's going to be costing much closer to that range, and the younger children are, the more expensive. It just has to be.
I think, again, having grappled with this a bit in my past from a policy standpoint, from a funding standpoint, I think one of the challenges has been as follows. I think on the one hand, people will readily now agree that quality early childhood education can make a difference. But they will also cite that, one, there's not a kind of clear quality standards in place, and so you're prone for variability, and you have variability in the K-12 system. And so they said we should expect that, so, we can say we want 100% high quality, but, how do you get there practically? And second of all, it's the notion of you're still constrained by the efficacy of the K-12 system. And so it's the whole notion of high quality, the benefits of that dissipate, right? And there have been studies, and that has been some of the concerns that's sometimes used to say you can invest billions of dollars in improving early childhood education, only to not reap the economic benefits of that because those gains are not sustained as you move further on in K-12. I'm curious in terms of perspectives that you all have had as you kind of come in these, maybe from a policy standpoint, Midori, or from a practical standpoint in Dallas.
I mean, at least from the narrow perspective of my role as the kind of new and first director of workforce development for the state, I think with a narrow view of how do we get more New Yorkers into sustainable wage jobs and childcare slash kind of quality education access is critical to that, and so that's where I can easily stop and end. And so, for us, and especially the employers that I engage in the work that I do, it's a kind of easy. We don't have to overthink it because we know the immediates are benefit, even if we are not focused on the long-term benefits. And so I think even from just focusing on that more narrow perspective of what is it going to take to ensure that we have New Yorkers entering sustainable wage jobs, staying there, which will power that much more economic growth in this state, which has had, kind of limited population growth compared to other states, which continues to face competition from not only low-wage locations in the United States, but also globally. For us, it's kind of, we have to do this, and so we don't need to necessarily even think about the kind of long-term, the other complications. For us, it's an easy case to say, yes, this is a priority, and that's where we are making a priority, not only through workforce development, but also the Governor's Child Care Task Force. We're really trying to think about, and in particular the point that Kelsey made, which is completely right, not just the kind of low wage end of the spectrum or the high wage, but really middle class New Yorkers who are spending an insane amount of their income and time managing, kind of informal and formal childcare relationships, which are just not working. Like, that is a system that is holding us back from an economic perspective.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, which is that, for most of human history, we've known that raising young children is a cornerstone task of our society. There aren't shortcuts to that. So the scary part of what you're talking about is, yes, that's absolutely the case. We need sustainable wage jobs, and we need people to be able to take them. And what I worry a great deal about is that, I don't want to say inevitably, but I worry a lot that what is going to end up happening is shortcuts are going to be taken on the baby side, right? It seems fine, the place looks good, and we know that the long-term consequences of that are going to be devastating. I actually, I was on a task force thing with Bank Street College of Education, looking at the childcare workforce. And one of the women who was participating as a professor at Bank Street, she does infant toddler development, she's been working with childcare centers across the city, low income and high income, and she said to me, on this call, that she thinks that this is like the human kind of rights catastrophe of our era. Like, what she's seeing, both for low income and high income kids, from what she knows as a developmental psychologist, is really is laying laying the groundwork for a very big problem that is going to be growing. And I think, turning to your point, yes, the K-12 system there's a lot of value lost in that system, unfortunately. You can think of the early childhood period as necessary but insufficient, right?
I think just adding on that, so I think, Josh mentioned this as the closest thing to a silver bullet that we have.
Right.
Which I agree when you're measuring to entering kindergarten. And then the data shows, I think you've got a huge leg up, and it's hugely beneficial for them when you're entering kindergarten. Then it's off to the K through 12 to see, does that benefit actually stick? And so you see in the research, right? If the K through 12 system isn't up to par and isn't also high quality, the impact diminishes. if you can sustain that, then it's obviously sustained through time. Like we actually call it's known as fade out. We call that the F word in Dallas. Fade out is bad. And so, but what's happening is that for too many years you've let it go that we didn't focus on early childhood. So now we're spending all of this money on middle school and all these other things, and we're taking it. So then it's hard for the K through 12 to keep up and have that high quality in kinder through third to have those impacts stay. And so I think it's got to take something of we need to invest, realizing that I still need to invest in the 8th graders today as well, but I need to make the investment now for the long term. Because if I don't, we're not going to get out of this cycle. And so how do I actually just start investing in the kids now that need it, so that we don't just continue to do this?
And I think the good news is I think we are seeing states pick this up. So we're actually seeing individual states recognize this, making the investments, and since clearly the bulk of the funding is either at the state or local level, my guess is that those will be the proof points that will ultimately support national policy should it move that way. But I think it's appropriate at the state level. I think we've talked about, obviously, the importance of early childhood education, the importance of the sector, the cost to the workforce of not having that in terms of lost productivity. It was interesting in reading some of the research that part of that loss in productivity is time that people in the workforce can't spend on education and training to keep up with the new skills of the future. So actually this has a profound knock-on effect because we all know that the requirements of the labor market are changing so rapidly that the importance of reskilling and upskilling and becoming more digitally fluent is incredibly important. And so can you talk maybe about that, Kelsey, in terms of that implication, in terms of the cost?
Yeah, I mean, we see, jobs are changing like crazy. So it's more important on the upskilling and the reskilling, and so thinking of that, and a lot of people are thinking about these skills, right? And so my job might be changing, but I've got some core skills, but I need to build on those skills. I need to get more, thinking about badges of skills that I need to have. And so you're right, there's a trade-off. And so I'm thinking, do I spend mind share trying to cobble together childcare, or do I just go home at 5 and then actually then not think about that and do that? So they're making those trade-offs, and I think, again, going back to the businesses of how can you better support the parent, not just we've talked a lot about childcare, but also thinking about what are they going through, what are they experiencing, what do they need to develop and continue in their pipeline of development, and how do I support them, which is can be beyond on that. And also I think there takes a lot of mind share of even just am I doing this parenting thing right? What's going on? And so giving them that support as well, so that they've got the confidence that they've got both, they can be successful at work and at home as a parent.
Yeah, I just want to add that, I think people know, if you're worried about your child, that takes up an enormous amount of your hard drive. It's enormously distracting to be worried about your child. There is some research, I've only seen a little bit of it, showing what common sense would suggest, which is that when parents are working and their child is in childcare that they don't feel good about, that's a tough decision. It is enormously detrimental to their productivity because they're just really distracted. So I think that that's just, as you're saying, just sort of, it's hard to be a productive worker when you're worried about your baby who's somewhere that you don't feel is a good place.
Yeah, and just adding to that, I think two things. One is that some of the more innovative workforce development organizations we have in New York City and New York State are addressing this issue by having parenting classes as part of, coupled with some of the hard skill and soft skill training. So not just for young, actual engaged young parents, but also parents who are middle-aged, who are worried about their kids in high school now and don't necessarily know how to actually productively manage both what they're experiencing at home with their children changing, as well as the workplace changing. And so that's one thing I would make a plug for all of you who are in the room, who are New Yorkers, who work in the space, to speak to employers about this, speak to training organizations, and apply for our new workforce development initiative, because we are trying to think of how can we better support more holistic models with the more flexible money we have to ensure that we can have better outcomes for those who are in our workforce development programs. And there's no doubt that either lack of access to affordable quality childcare affects not only individuals to get into the workplace, but again, kind of move up and thrive as well. Because if you have a decision of whether or not you can take the extra, kind of course at your community college that will allow you to get a, additional $1 an hour wage versus to have somebody take care of your child, that's an often rational economic decision to say, actually, I can't do that, and that holds our economy back in the state.
Well, I was struck this notion of the potential for these innovative models, through parenting. And one thing that I think it came up in a discussion that I found fascinating was that early on, birth of a child, that's such a life event, right, for the family, that it's also a moment of openness and receptivity for the adults. And so in terms of, so you can think about them in terms of how they can be a better parent, how you set the foundation for their child, but also allows them to reframe how they think about themselves in the context of the changing labor market. Can you talk about some of the research and the implications of that?
Yeah, and it's not even how they're thinking about themselves, it's their brain chemistry. So what the neuroscience is showing is that there are these sort of what they call kind of critical windows or sensitive periods of development. Prenatal is obviously huge. Birth to 3, birth to 5 is a very intense period of sort of receptivity to the environment. So these are periods where you are much more sensitive to the environment. The way the environment is has a much more profound impact on your development. So one way of thinking about this is through a metaphor of wet concrete. So we know that when the concrete's first laid, you just barely touch it and it makes a deep impression. Several hours later, or several days later, that's the same material, right? Time has passed, and you cannot make a mark in it without breaking your hand. Even if you break your hand, you're not going to make a mark in it. So there's just different periods where it's the same exact thing. Your brain is kind of more susceptible to the environment like wet concrete. So one of them is early childhood. A second one, if any of you have adolescent teenagers at home, you'll be happy to know, that is also a second period, which is maybe not the more pleasant one, but that is a period where a lot is going on, and it's worth paying attention, unfortunately, because children are really they're more vulnerable at that time than they appear. And then the final phase that they've done very recent research on is becoming a parent. So now we know that sort of psychologically, as you said, the way you said, oh, now I'm a parent. But they have done research on humans, but also they've done rat studies that show the changes in the brain chemistry that occur when you become a parent. So for populations that are for people, for example, who are not engaged in the workforce, who have not figured out how to kind of get themselves onto a path, when they become a parent, this is something that I know Parent Child Plus works explicitly with, when they become a parent, they are more susceptible to learning and growing and changing at that time. So it's really an extraordinary moment of opportunity for the child, as you said, sort of two generations sometimes, for the child and the parent, that we are, I think, just recognizing, we're just recognizing it now. Did you want to?
And it doesn't have it, I can imagine that what seems to me from an employer standpoint, that could have tremendous implications. Because we're seeing the first problem we're trying to solve is how do we actually have a productive member of the workforce? And part of that is the degree they can be supported with quality and affordable early childhood education. That makes them more productive in their current job. But to the degree at the moment, especially of new parenting at that moment, if it also makes them more open to perhaps upskilling, training, right, in a way it seems to me you're actually kind of minimizing the downside and potentially getting real benefit on the upside. Do many employers think about it that way in your experience?
No.
Yeah, it's amazing. I don't think so at all, and I think when I talk to our corporate clients, it's much more about how do we support and thinking about like family leave, right? Like, and so I think there is more openness to this. Like, you see much more, you know, like programs that are extending that, right? And so like even non-working parents now have more parental leave and all these things, but they're not thinking of it as a time of like, I can also help them think about like what's next in their career. How are they gonna think about this? How can they actually upskill, like using this as an opportunity? I think, you know, it's still new and I think, but if this is a time that you can actually do that, I think that a lot of businesses would be open to that and receptive to that.
So maybe we're going to open up to questions here pretty shortly. You know, we've talked about the various aspects of it. When you think about, again, what would be either call it admonition or suggested kind of action, either from a policymaker's perspective, from an employer's perspective, from a philanthropic, right? How do we, again, this is a problem with many different facets to it, benefits also multifaceted. How do we kind of move forward collectively to try to make some progress against this?
As I've said again, I think K-12 is a perfect model for this. The business community got very engaged in K-12 over the last 20 years in a whole range of ways. I think it's the #1 corporate philanthropy. I'm not sure about that, but it's, you know, both in terms of direct giving, in terms of in-kind services, and in terms of policy pressure. The business community sent a very clear message to states in every single, across the country, that we need the K-12 system to be good. Well, that's actually not happening, but they still are saying it, and the money's going up, 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 up. The results are flat, that's just actually the truth of it, but the money's going up. And so what I would suggest to the business community is take that focus and start turning it in this area, because #1, it's even more important than K-12, and #2, there is a direct today benefit to the business community. That's my thought.
Yeah, and I would say just from the role of being in government now and government in New York State, where again, I hope most of you live and can help advocate as well, is that we do have, I think, a tremendous opportunity. New York State recently passed, the governor recently implemented among the most comprehensive, if not the most comprehensive, paid family leave legislation in the country. We have a childcare task force because we do want to make this a next priority, but we really need the engagement of the business community, of the advocacy community to really help us find models that work. So I encourage you to really, and we can send around kind of what our various task force meetings are to really get your engagement, because I think we're trying to spotlight this, but we need people to come and participate and hopefully help advocate as well. And then finally, I would also say, because we do have this new workforce development initiative, we have a historic $175 million that we've invested in new flexible funding sources. The only way we can spend that money well is if we have good applications coming in the door that allow us to use this flexibility that we now have. And having launched this program 4 months ago, seeing the initial applications come in the door, the applications are fine. We have some fine proposals, but they're very traditional in workforce development. And we have the new opportunity to actually couple it with childcare, to think about childcare as an industry, to think about the other barriers that are keeping populations from working and moving up in their career. And we can only spend that money well if we get good creative proposals in the door. So I think that's a very tangible thing, again, for those of you who are New Yorkers in the room, who do work in New York in the room, please help us. By applying, by participating, because we almost are responding to the advocacy community that we want more flexibility. Now we have it, but we need you to actually use it. So please just really make a call to action for all of you on that. So particularly here, we are at a tremendous opportunity to change, but we kind of need support to continue to change.
I would just add to that, if you're, you know, a business or even an organization supporting like Parent Child Plus, is actually talking to parents to making, like, understanding what are you actually going through, what do you need. Yes, totally agree with all the childcare support, but also beyond that, what kind of things are you struggling with, what is taking mind share away, how can we actually ease those? And so I think there's additional programs and offerings that you can also have that can better support the parent, as well as supporting, you know, actually caring for the child at the same time.
mean, it's, from my perspective, I think as challenging as it is, I think the role that philanthropy can play in this is also helping to provide mechanisms that actually bring a more blended approach and bringing these communities together. And I think so we can bring the caregiver, the employer, right, and some of the research and other elements together, you actually you increase the potential you're going to find a definable and sustainable model. And I think that's an important role in organizations like Parent Child Plus who are doing that. I think are critical in that and need support. So with that, let me transition now and invite any questions from the audience. And we don't have a roving mic, so just stand and go.
Sorry, can I ask a question? So the term quality was tossed out a lot, but I kind of think of quality a bit like art, right? It's in the eyes of the beholder. How do you guys think about that, without putting those certification or additional skills in terms of cost? How do you think about defining and measuring quality in that early childhood context?
So the kind of conventionally, there have been a whole range of metrics used, like square footage and the windows and how many windows there are and so forth, which are called kind of structural measures of quality. And what the research is really pretty clear on, which I actually think is also common sense, is that beyond basic health and safety, like there's not electric cords lying around, we know what quality looks like for young children. It is engagement. It is responsive, nurturing engagement, which I actually lived for several years in Nicaragua, in between Manhattan and a conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. And what was interesting is that in Nicaragua, people still are pretty good at being with young children. Like somehow we have lost, not obviously entirely, but we've lost this foundation of understanding what young children need. And now it is like art, or what was that they said? I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it, right? So it's very difficult because any one of us knows what we would like our child that we care about to be treated. How you measure that on a large scale is difficult. But there are many people who are working on this, and it's not at all impossible to do. I think that the key is to keep focused on what really matters. Because if you are in a beautiful classroom with, Montessori, all kinds of things, but there is not rich, nurturing, human, kind of talking back and forth, as you said, they obviously explained to you well. It's like the kid says something, the kid says, oh, look at the truck, or no, truck, and you say, oh, there's a truck, what color is the truck? And then where do you think the truck is going, right? Which is what parents do. It's just sort of talking. It doesn't have to be in your face all the time. It just has to be a supportive, nurturing, language-rich environment, which is simple and straightforward, and you know it when you see it, and hard to put into kind of government terms.
But that said, only as governments do. Many states there have been these quality rating frameworks that have been put forward that states have adopted. Oftentimes they go through a peer review, and they will pick up on some of these metrics, and they will do things like, obviously there's instructor ratios, is there a holistic kind of an evaluation and kind of engagement approach, not just cognitive, not just social. So there are in fact a series of a rubric, if you will, that are generally adopted at the state level, and then early childhood centers that generally receive state funds and also federal funds, and increasingly are being evaluated against that to try to provide some kind of quality rating systems.
This idea of the pre-childhood gains dissipating over the life of K through 12, in some instances I was struck by the 50% on the NEA not meeting standards. The studies that have been done on that, are those national, are those state? Do you have any more data around that?
Can I just answer something? I'll say something real quick. So I want to point something out. It is not actually the case that early childhood experiences fade out over K-12. And the way we know that is that children who grow up in particular home environments enter kindergarten ahead, and they stay ahead. Those are early childhood experiences. So the studies that are talking about this fade out are actually, what that's talking about is particular early childhood programs, most of which are very few number of hours relative. So for example, a child who has been in full-time childcare entering an infancy, by the time they have reached kindergarten, they will have spent about 12,000 hours in childcare. A full day, full year pre-K program is 1,200 hours. So there's just going to be a limited impact of 1,200 hours for a 4-year-old, or even, that's full day, right? Or even 2,400 hours starting when you're 3. And but it's clear that early childhood experiences do not fade out, because that is why children from certain families who've had certain advantages in their home continue to be more successful. I mean, we see that in the data clearly.
Well, I'd say that there are some areas where you see the fade out, and those are usually like local studies. So the most probably common one is from Tennessee. So Tennessee actually did a program where they were going to do public pre-K. They actually, it was actually a standardized test. Some kids got it, some kids didn't, and then they followed them through 3rd grade. That one, when they originally did it, saw that there was a fade out. So those kids that went to pre-K were on par when they started kindergarten, or like you saw a positive impact. By the time they got to 3rd grade, that impact had kind of disappeared. They even in the report said that is not a result of pre-K. That is because we fell short on the K through 3. And so I do think that study was very national, got a lot of attention. I know in Texas, where I'm at, legislators were pointing to that of why are we investing in pre-K? So I think it's helpful to continue. There's since then been, huge studies even in the city of Dallas that we've said we don't experience that. Tennessee's even come back. They have now a new study where they, again, have seen that we've increased the quality of that. You actually see the sustained impact of it. So I do think there's pockets, and so but it's helping us, I think, learn what's the important parts of pre-K that need to be there, and what are the important things that you need to couple in K through 12 to actually see those impacts sustained. The other thing I'll preface this with is that this is all done on standardized tests and mostly on reading. But it doesn't capture, which I truly believe in on early childhood, right, is the social and emotional aspects, the executive functions. Those things I think are sustained for sure. But it's, again, back to this, how do you measure quality? It's really hard to measure those and to keep those. And so instead, most states do, we're going to do reading and math because that's very easy. And so I do think there's probably, even though in the standardized tests you might find pockets where they're not sustained, those kids are probably better off and on a better trajectory in life because of the early childhood experiences that they had.
I just want to add the editorial comment that most of those studies are all done just based on a pre-K experience fading out. And as you've heard from our panelists, the 0 to 3 years are of critical importance, and they haven't looked at what happens to children who get a really quality life experience both at home and in care from birth through pre-K and then get to school. And I think as Catherine noted, we do have some evidence around the fact that children from more resourced and supported home environments, actually, even if they go into a less good urban school environment, are going to navigate it much more successfully. And their parents are going to be prepared to navigate it much more successfully. And I think that's part of the great comments you all have made about the need to support parents in their role of parents as well.
I think one of the real challenges for K-12 has been to get the K-12 system to actually adopt a birth to 3rd grade as the framing, so that you actually have more continuity there. And you're getting your early grades in the K-12 system to be liaison and more in the community as the intake. And as you have more universal preschool, you're starting to move that to pre-K and earlier and earlier. So I think it's the trajectory is positive, but I'd say most school districts don't have that perspective. But I think people clearly recognize that that's the right way to think about it. We'll go here and then we'll go left. On my left, stage left. Go ahead.
I have a question about that. I was intrigued by the broken business model, right? Wages are too low in for childcare workers, but at the same time it's too expensive for those who are seeking childcare. Is the only solution government intervention on subsidizing childcare? Are there other answers to sort of reconciling the business model for quality childcare that you know of?
K-12 is the model. You know, if people had to pay for fourth grade out of their pocket, lots and lots of kids would not be in fourth grade. So, that's just what it boils down to.
I do think there's work that we can do on figuring out how do we get the model as best as we can before you increase public funding, so that you know, right, that like, yes, this is the way to go, and so like this is going to maximize impact. So I do think there's still work of like, this is the model we need to go with, but I do agree at some point it's going to require public funding. I think you can, to find that good model, you might have philanthropic funded for a small period of time to prove this is work, but then it's going to have to at some point go to public.
Yeah, and I've been in states where I suggest that you could eliminate 12th grade and maybe 11th grade too, and put that money in, and no one ever seems to have any problem with that at all. So, I mean, that's not here. This is, our city's different, but, right, I think it'll be different here. But there are places, like say Idaho, where, you know, people are there, the state is really focused a lot on kind of workforce training programs. So there's kids there are kids who have dropped out of high school or going to drop out of high school, or are still literally physically going to the building but have essentially dropped out of high school. So if we stopped forcing those kids to be in school and created other opportunities, perhaps as childcare providers, and then shifted the funds earlier in the pipeline, that would be a much more rational model, I think.
And I think it just keeps, I would agree that to provide long-term sustainable is probably going to have to be public funded. The issue becomes where the revenues come from. And I don't think you can fund it through the current tax regimes that are in place. So perhaps at the state level, but a property tax model that funds it doesn't work, right? The economic benefits are going to be societal as well as business, so there needs to be a kind of a shared revenue model. So I think you need a tax scheme that would then allow, right? And then that would be more sustainable and not just a referendum to raise taxes, which we know would be problematic across many states. There's a question on this side.
There was. I was interested, I think, Catherine, you mentioned the blended funding streams in Mississippi between workforce development and early childcare. Do you know of any other states that are doing that that are blending those streams to make it more efficient?
No, I know states that are talking about it. Are you guys doing that? Do you want to talk about trying to do that? Yeah.
Well, so it's I mean, not across our system, but with our new $175 million flexible workforce development initiative effort, we are encouraging and have flexibility for applicants to use funding for not just core workforce development activities, but other barriers that are keeping people from obtaining skills to work, including childcare, transportation, behavioral, mental health supports. And that's something we're encouraging applicants to apply for, because if we can broaden the set of proof points that this works, that allows us to better think about how do we make a system that works. But we need those proof points.
So if you're interested, or I think you guys want to send stuff around, I can send information on the Mississippi plan and the factory that's doing it. But it was exactly this. I mean, it sounds like you just need a proposal. I mean, it's right, yeah.
The thing I'll say is I haven't seen many states actually blending, but I do think there's a lot more effort to coordinate across. And so there was a pre-K development grant that went around that most states got, and that actually requires that you actually coordinate better across agencies. I know in Texas, right, it's between like the Texas Education Agency, the Health and Human Services, the workforce, and like there's one other one, and they're all now they actually share a resource even to be much more coordinated and see how can they actually blend them, even though they're not blended on that side, how do I get them and make them blended?
So I read this article over the summer that was a little provocative, and it was talking about how we're making all these investments in early childhood and K-12, and we're just ignoring the elephant in the room of that poverty is really at the root cause of why we need to spend so much money. And so I'm wondering, like, when you talk about swimming upstream from K-12 to early childhood, how do you think about going even upstream a bit more and saying, what's the role of our government or these organizations to not just try to fix poverty through these programs, but actually invest in like this root cause issue?
So, there is a headline that's been out there that says research shows that poverty causes smaller brains. And that is not true. What is true is that bad nutrition causes stunted physical growth. And it is also true that inadequately nutritious environments cause sort of stunted cognitive and emotional growth. But there are families who are very poor, who are still providing rich, supportive, nurturing, interactive environments for their children, and there are very wealthy people who are not providing those environments for children. Now, the wealthy people tend to have more money to fix problems that maybe they caused, right? So it's not as visible to us because they're just filling in a lot of gaps. And so I think that in my view, poverty is highly correlated with circumstances that are likely to make it difficult for parents to be providing the kind of environment for their children need to thrive. And that is the work that Parent-Child Plus is doing extremely well. I mean, so I think that these things have to go in tandem. It's like just like a child is at home, a child is, we need to be focused on the childcare environments for the reasons we've been talking about, but the home environment underpins it, and to be looking at these kind of work, putting those things together is, children won't be successful if we don't do that.
I think it's also why it's so important to talk about these two issues at once, right? And so, yes, we know that we want the child in high quality educational environment, but then how do we also work to have those parents actually be in a better environment? So how do we actually work with them to develop their skills or to reskill them or actually provide them the ability to be in the workforce? And so I think by addressing both of those, you can help move the parents up, as well as making sure that you're providing the opportunities for that brain stimulation and the high quality that they can actually grow and develop at the same time.
I'll just add to support that. I mean, I think that's where, at least in New York State, there's probably a reason why we have this new position that I'm occupying to kind of think about workforce development in a more comprehensive way, coupled with the governor's major push in thinking about childcare and our education system as well, because I think from our perspective, both are critical to ensure that we have a strong economy that is pulling up more New Yorkers in a sustainable way.
And I would just say, to address that in closing as well, clearly addressing poverty is a multifaceted problem. It's going to take a very kind of a blended solution, so to speak. But I think still there's still a compelling argument supported by research that says having a strong education and skills foundation is a key plank to any solution that's going to fundamentally address poverty. And so it remains still true today that the level of education is still highly correlated with lifetime earnings, right? And then increasingly, that's going to be defined not just in traditional degrees, it's going to be defined in other ways. And so I think that's very true. And so you see that in the workforce today where employers are struggling to keep up with the skills that are in demand. And those skills that are high in demand often have sustainable and good career trajectory and sustainable wages. Those that aren't are kind of being left behind. We also know that's directly correlated if you don't, 0 to 3 have good foundation, the likelihood that you're going to persist. So I think having this, understanding it from a workforce perspective and understanding it from an early learning perspective is a critical kind of foundation to address it. I think the last thing is we talk about 2 generations. The only other perspective I will leave you in closing with, it's not just a 2-generation issue. The research would also show that parents who have not achieved some level of post-secondary education and attainment, that's a generational effect that affects not just their children, but their children's children. So that's when we're talking about a multi-generational problem. And so the approach of Parent-Child Plus, in terms of not just providing early childhood education, ensuring that quality and support, the parent in doing so, and helping the parent navigate, is having a multi-generational effect, which I think is needed and is going to be part of the solution going forward. So with that, let me thank and ask you to join me in thanking our panelists.
Lisa?
Thank you. Just in closing, first of all, this was an amazing panel. And I know even some of the panelists had their doubts when we started trying to formulate this conversation about exactly what the flow would be. And this is an unusual panel. People aren't bringing these views and these vantage points together to really talk about how to solve some of these huge challenges that we all face. And I think these guys have gotten us off to an amazing start. We cannot thank you enough. I do want to be sure you understand that all of the lovely references to Parent-Child Plus were not planted, but we thank them all very much for that. Another round of applause. This was better than we could have imagined, so thank you. Just two quick things. For those of you who were at the first forum that we held here about a year ago, one of the things that we previewed at that forum was a new partnership between Parent-Child Plus and Public Prep, and Ian Rose there in the back of the room. And we want to tell you all that it has launched, it is growing, it is successful, and really wraps itself around some of these issues of really supporting parents both in the 0 to 3 phase, but also as their children are moving through school, so that at each of these critical points, parents are getting the support we need. So Ian and I are both here to talk about that afterwards. And lastly, I want to preview for you, in a way that the panel has beautifully, our next School Readiness Forum, date to be announced, but we're deciding whether we're going to risk the winter, if it exists in New York anymore, or early spring, but it will be on family child care. At the family child care workforce, the reasons why family child care is so critical to low-income and immigrant families, particularly in the 0 to 3 years, and a little bit on some of the exciting new work that Parent-Child Plus is doing to support the quality of family child care settings. So you will all be getting information on that. We also are going to send out afterwards. Our panel was great in sharing amongst themselves an array of readings before the panel. We're going to share all of those out with all of you. Would love any other suggestions of articles that you all have read in the field that would be useful. We're also going to share out the Workforce Initiative information, and I'm already thinking about who could we partner with to apply. And the task force meetings and everything else the panel gives us that's relevant. So look forward to lots more communication and seeing you sometime soon to talk about family child care. Thank you all so much for being here.